The jungle doesn't warn you. That's the first thing I'd want anyone to understand. There's no dramatic pause, no moment where the air thickens and the hairs stand on the back of your neck, and you have time to process what's coming. 1 second you're moving on azimuth through primary growth in the Yucatan, and the next second 2 of your men are dead, and something that should not exist on this planet is standing over them in a shimmer of bent light, peeling its own face open like a man loosening a collar. I was a sniper before that mission. 11 years of service, 4 deployments, 112 confirmed. I understood kill geometry the way a carpenter understands grain instinctively in the body without having to think it through. I had never, in 11 years, fired at something and felt afraid of what would happen if I missed. That changed in the Yucatan. My team was 3 people. Rodriguez ran point. Alvarez carried the radio. I carried the rifle and made the decisions. We were there to extract a source, a man who'd been feeding targeting data to 3 different governments simultaneously and had decided, finally, that one of them was going to figure that out and clean up the problem. Standard work. The kind of job where the paperwork is classified and the mission never happened regardless of outcome. The ship came down in the tree canopy approximately 400 meters northeast of our position. I heard it before I saw it, a sound like a train derailing in slow motion, metal under compression, then a pressure wave that knocked leaves from trees and set every bird in a square kilometer into panicked flight. We went aground on instinct. Rodriguez looked at me. I looked at him. We had no language for what we were hearing. What came out of the wreckage wasn't a man. I've tried to describe it to people who weren't there. The body was humanoid in the broadest sense, upright, bilateral symmetry, 2 arms, 2 legs, but the proportions were wrong. The shoulders too broad, the arms too long, the head carrying that facial structure that looked designed rather than evolved. Mandibles instead of lips, 4 of them, layered and jointed, and eyes that caught light the way a cat's do, with a kind of cold internal phosphorescence. It stood close to 8 feet. It moved the way a predator moves, deliberate, unhurried, with complete confidence that nothing in its environment could threaten it. It was right for about 40 seconds. Alvarez broke first. I don't blame him. Most men would have. He came up from cover and ran, and the creature tracked him without apparent urgency, raised something that looked like a cannon mounted on its shoulder, and put a plasma bolt through Alvarez's center mass. The sound was a thunderclap with a light show attached. Alvarez was gone before he hit the ground. Rodriguez opened up with his rifle on full automatic. The rounds found the creature. I could see the impacts, and the creature absorbed them and turned toward him with what I can only describe as irritation, like a man who's been flicked on the ear. I put a .338 Lapua round through the junction of its neck and left shoulder from 110 meters. That got its attention. I had time to notice in the seconds that followed that the creature bled green, that the wound steamed in the humid air, that it staggered, actually staggered, and pressed one massive hand to the wound with what looked like genuine surprise. I shot it again, same shoulder, slightly lower. It went down to 1 knee. What I did next was stupid, and I've spent a long time arguing with myself about whether I'd do it differently. I moved forward instead of back. I moved toward the wreckage while the creature was dealing with the 2 rounds in its shoulder, and I went into the ship, and I took what I could reach in the time I had. A helmet, heavy and warm, and covered in symbols I didn't understand. A gauntlet assembly, articulated, with a small sphere seated in a socket near the wrist that caught light strangely. I took both. I moved back out into the jungle. The creature was standing again by the time I cleared the wreck. It had done something to its shoulder. I don't know what, a stimulant, a seal, some biology I had no framework for, and it was standing, and it was oriented toward me, and its eyes found me through the tree cover the way eyes shouldn't be able to at that distance. I ran. I ran for 40 minutes without stopping. I lost the creature somewhere in the 2nd kilometer. Later, I'd learned that this was because the sphere I'd taken out of the gauntlet emitted some kind of cloaking field when activated under stress, and that I had apparently been invisible for most of that run. At the time, I thought I had simply outrun something that moved like a freight train. I didn't outrun anything. I borrowed time. The government found me at a road crossing 6 kilometers from the crash site. They came in force, 3 vehicles, 12 men. A man in a clean suit who introduced himself as Traeger and looked at me the way a collector looks at something he's been hunting for years. He took the helmet. He took the gauntlet. He told me that if I said a word about what I'd seen to anyone, I would spend the rest of my life in a cell so far off the books that my family would assume I'd walked into traffic. I sent the equipment ahead to my post office box before he got there. A calculated gamble. I'd spent 11 years making those, and most of them had worked out. This one had consequences I hadn't calculated. They put me on a transport with a group of men who'd also seen things and been made to disappear. Williams, who'd done 2 tours in the Pacific and had the kind of stillness that only comes from being very good at controlled violence. Coyle, who processed fear through his mouth and hadn't stopped talking since we loaded the bus. Baxley, a medic with a particular medical condition that caused him to say the wrong thing at the wrong moment, which he'd learned to work around. Nettles, who'd flown combat helicopters for 9 years and treated catastrophe with the professional calm of a man who'd learned that panic costs altitude. Lynch, who didn't talk much and watched everything. And then in the facility, there was Brackett. She was a scientist, evolutionary biology. They'd pulled her in to look at the creature they'd recovered, the one I'd shot twice in the shoulder, which had apparently let itself be captured, which I'd have thought about harder if I'd known it at the time. She found me in a hallway between the secure wing and wherever they were keeping the misfit soldiers, and she looked at me the way people look at the only other person in the room who knows something they're not supposed to know. "You shot it," she said, not a question. "Twice," I said. "With what?" "338 Lapua, bolt action." She processed this. It healed. "I know." "How long?" "Less than 5 minutes, functionally." She was quiet for a moment. She had the look of someone reformatting every assumption she'd made about the world. I recognized it. I'd had it myself for about 30 seconds in the Yucatan before the training took over and I started making decisions instead. "The DNA profiles," she said eventually. "They're not just similar to human. They contain human sequences, deliberately introduced." "What does that mean?" "It means they've been collecting from us, splicing, improving themselves with what they take. It means we're not just prey to them." She paused. "We're a resource." The creature got loose 3 hours later. I won't go through every detail of what happened in the facility. The important things are these. The creature moved through a building full of armed government security, the way water moves through a cracked hull. It killed everyone who came at it with a weapon. It stopped when it encountered Brackett, who was unarmed, and it looked at her for a long moment in the way predators look at things they're deciding about, and then it walked past her and went out through a wall. Not a door, a wall. The Stargazer facility was built to contain things. Reinforced concrete, rated security doors, a guard complement of 60 men who had all been selected for competence and discretion. I'd been in it for less than a day, but I'd spent that day the way I always spend unfamiliar environments, mapping it, identifying load-bearing assumptions, noting where the design had been optimized for the threat they thought they were containing rather than the threat they actually had. The threat they had could punch through reinforced concrete without significantly slowing its stride. 60 men with standard weapons reduced that to noise and delay, which is not nothing. Delay has saved lives in every war ever fought, but it is not containment. Traeger watched his facility come apart from a monitoring station, and his response was to order more men into the kill zone, which is the institutional response to situations that institutional thinking cannot process. More resources, more force, more of the same thing that isn't working, applied harder. I watched 12 of his men die in 4 minutes on a monitor screen and I thought, this is what it looks like when a civilization meets something outside its operational parameters and refuses to update. The creature wasn't exceptional by the standards of its own kind. It was, by Brackett's assessment, a mid-tier specimen at best. The original, the one I'd shot in the Yucatan, was apparently the smaller and less advanced of the two that had come to Earth. A scout, a rogue. Something operating well below what the species could field. And it walked through Traeger's facility like it wasn't there. While all of that was happening, my son Rory was wearing an alien combat helmet to a Halloween party. I hadn't known my son long enough by that point. His mother and I had split 2 years prior, and I'd been deployed for most of what came before that. Rory was 11. He had a way of thinking that didn't map to the way other people thought, pattern recognition that was almost supernatural, an ability to pull signal from noise that I'd seen in experienced analysts but never in a child. The school system had a label for it. I never cared much about the label. He was my son, and he was sharp in ways I didn't fully understand yet, and I had gotten him into this without meaning to, by sending him equipment that no one on Earth should have had. He'd activated the guidance system in the helmet. Apparently it was straightforward if you understood the interface, and he'd understood the interface in an afternoon. He'd knocked a mother ship off its approach vector and deactivated its cloaking field over a major urban corridor. The Air Force had scrambled jets. None of that stopped the mother ship, but it complicated the arrival considerably, and the bigger creature aboard it. The one I will call the Upgrade, because that's what the Stargazer Project files called it, and because the name is accurate, the Upgrade had noticed. It had noticed my son specifically. The loonies, that's what Coyle called us, and it stuck. We got out of the facility in the confusion of the breakout. Brackett came with us. I want to be fair about what they were. Williams had a code and didn't deviate from it. Coyle was brave in the way that men who can't stop talking are brave, which is to say completely and without apparent calculation. Baxley and Nettles had both been in enough bad situations that another bad situation registered primarily as context rather than crisis. Lynch was simply reliable, which is one of the rarest human qualities and one of the most valuable. We found Rory at his school, which had become a kill ground. The dogs came first. The Upgrade had sent them, creatures the size of large horses, built for pursuit, with enough intelligence to work in coordinated pairs. They hit the school from 2 angles simultaneously, and what stopped them was not our firepower, though we used plenty of it. What stopped them was Rory. He'd been talking to one of them. I don't mean this metaphorically. He had found a frequency on the helmet, a carrier wave that the dogs responded to, and he had been broadcasting on it since before we arrived. And by the time we got there, one of the dogs had stopped acting like a weapon and was sitting next to him with the specific stillness of an animal that has decided it is no longer in conflict. "Dad," he said when he saw me, "this one has a head injury. It's confused. I think it wants to go home." I didn't have time to process the emotional weight of my son, saying the word dad with that particular casual certainty, so I filed it and moved. The original creature found us in the school gymnasium. Not the Upgrade, the other one, the one I'd shot in the Yucatan, the one that was smaller by the relative standards of that species, which still put it at better than 7 feet and 300 pounds of killing capability. It came through the gymnasium roof in a controlled descent and landed in a crouch and looked at Rory for a long time before it looked at me. And then it held out its hand. Not a weapon, not a threat, a gesture I've made 1,000 times across a dozen countries, reaching toward an ally with something to pass. In its palm was a small device, compact, alien in construction, with an interface that glowed with the same symbol set as the helmet Rory was wearing. The Upgrade killed it before either of us could understand what was being offered. The Upgrade came through the gymnasium wall, not the roof, the wall, because that was simply a more direct approach, and it was enormous. Where the original creature had been massive in the way of something that had evolved to be an apex predator, the Upgrade was massive in the way of something that had been engineered past the limits of what evolution produces. 8.5 feet, possibly more. The carapace was partially mechanical, integrated, built into the biology in ways that Brackett said later indicated deliberate modification over multiple generations. It killed the original creature in approximately 4 seconds, which is not a fight, it's a termination. Then it looked at my son. I've been in situations that I would describe as desperate. Combat has a way of generating those, but there is a particular quality to the feeling of standing between your child and something that has traveled between stars in order to acquire him, a feeling that sits outside of training and outside of experience, and reduces to something very old and not very complicated. I raised my rifle. I understood completely that this was insufficient. The loonies moved without a word between them. Williams came in from the left. Nettles had gotten airborne in a recovered vehicle and was creating a distraction from above. Coyle and Baxley hit the creature from opposite sides with everything they were carrying, and Brackett was yelling something about the plasma caster, about the targeting mechanism, about a specific geometry of attack that she'd worked out from 3 hours of examination of the original creature's hardware. We heard it, I want to be clear about that. We heard it badly, but it didn't go down. Lynch died in the gymnasium. He went for the creature's legs with a shaped charge at close range, and he got the legs, and the creature went down to one knee, and then it got back up. Lynch didn't. We ran. We ran with the device the original creature had tried to give us, and with Rory still wearing the helmet, and with the upgrade behind us, and Traeger's government forces in front of us, because Traeger had decided that Rory represented a strategic asset worth preserving regardless of who else got expended in the process. Traeger died in the woods outside the facility. The upgrade killed him. He'd been maneuvering with his remaining security detail, professional men, doing what they were paid to do, working on the assumption that sufficient numbers could contain the situation. And he'd gotten close enough to the upgrade that it noticed him, and it determined with whatever calculus, it used that he was the highest threat individual in his group, and it removed him in the specific thorough way that species uses when it wants to make a point. I want to record this without satisfaction because he was a human being, but I also want to record that his decision-making throughout the preceding 12 hours had been driven entirely by the belief that he could manage this situation from a position of institutional authority, and that institutional authority means nothing to something that has been hunting species for 1,000 years. There's a lesson in that. I'm not going to belabor it. We found a barn 3 kilometers from the school and took stock. The barn was old, timber-framed, smelling of hay that had dried out 2 seasons ago, and the particular cold of a structure that keeps the wind out but not the temperature. There was a rusted tractor in one corner and enough ambient darkness that we could work without showing light through the gaps in the siding. I'd been in worse command posts. I'd been in worse in better countries under better circumstances. Coyle had taken a plasma round through the right side of his chest and was sitting against a wall breathing in a way that told me we had 2 hours before that became a different kind of problem. Baxley was working on him with what he had, which wasn't much, but Baxley had always made do with what he had. Williams had a gash across his left arm from the gymnasium wall collapse, deep enough to need stitching, not deep enough to compromise function, and he'd wrapped it himself without comment. Nettles was down. He'd taken the vehicle too close to the upgrade in the second pass and paid the price, and I didn't know yet if he was alive. Brackett had a field dressing on her forehead and the focused intensity of someone who has decided that grief is a scheduled activity for after the immediate problem is solved. Lynch we left in the gymnasium. We had no choice in that, and I am not going to spend words pretending it sat easily. I inventoried what we were carrying. It took 4 minutes and the results were not encouraging. 2 rifles, one with a full magazine and one with 7 rounds. A sidearm each for Williams and Nettles, assuming Nettles was alive to use one. Baxley's medical kit, which he was burning through rapidly. Coyle's shaped charge, Lynch's shaped charge, which Coyle had taken off Lynch's kit before we moved. An alien device the size of a shoebox, cooling on the barn floor between me and Rory. 8 people, approximately, against something that had walked through a hardened government facility without working up a noticeable sweat. I sat on the barn floor and I looked at what we had, and I thought about how to make it enough. Rory sat in the middle of the barn floor and turned the device over in his hands. "It's a suit," he said. "What?" "The thing the other one was trying to give us, the one the big one killed." He looked up at me. He had his mother's patience, which I've never had. "It's a suit, armor. It was bringing it here for us," or he paused, "for me, but I think it was supposed to be for whoever needed it." Brackett came over and looked at the device in his hands. She was quiet for a moment. "The smaller one went rogue," she said. "It was coming to Earth against orders. It killed its own people to get here." "Why?" William said. "Because it had been watching us," Brackett said, "long enough to conclude that we were worth the effort, that whatever happens next, whatever the upgrade is the leading edge of, we were going to need more than what we have. There's a thing that happens sometimes in very bad situations, in the darkest part of them, after you've taken losses and you're down to the last of your options. The situation stops being abstract. You stop thinking about outcomes and variables and start thinking about the specific, concrete thing in front of you, which is the only thing that matters. Every calculation simplifies to a single question. What can we do with what we have? What we had: 1 rifle with 11 rounds, 1 former combat pilot who might still be alive in a crashed vehicle 3 kilometers behind us, 1 evolutionary biologist who had spent 3 hours studying the original creature's hardware and had apparently retained every detail, 4 surviving soldiers, one of whom was breathing wrong, 1 alien device that my son could read. And my son. I'm not going to claim I understood what Rory was doing with the device in those 40 minutes in the barn. Brackett tried to explain the interface to me twice, and I understood perhaps 1 word in 5, and I have a working intelligence and 11 years of high-stress problem solving behind me. Rory worked through it in silence, occasionally asking Brackett a question in the specific, precise way he asked questions, not conversationally, but targeted, like he was pulling single threads from a larger fabric, each one placed exactly where he needed it. At one point he looked up at me and said, "The targeting system on the big one. It reads heat signatures, movement, body chemistry. It distinguishes between threat and non-threat based on whether the target is holding a weapon." "Okay," I said. "So if we're not holding weapons when it locks on?" "It won't fire," Brackett said. She'd been following his reasoning faster than I had. "Or it'll downgrade the threat assessment. It hunts combatants. That's the sport of it. It doesn't want prey that can't fight back." Rory nodded. "But we can use that." He was 11 years old, working out the targeting parameters of an extraterrestrial weapons system in a barn in the middle of the night, based on 40 minutes with a device he'd never seen before, drawing on a language he'd learned in an afternoon. I thought about the word the Stargazer files had used: resource. The idea that these hunters had been splicing human genetic sequences into their own population for centuries, taking the best of what they found in us and incorporating it. And I thought, you took the wrong thing. You looked at us and you saw the muscle and the aggression and the territorial instinct, the things that looked like what you already were. You took the parts that resembled yourself. You missed the part that mattered. The part that looks at a problem it cannot solve and solves it anyway, in 40 minutes, in a barn, with inadequate materials and no formal training, and a father standing over its shoulder trying not to show how scared he is. We moved before the upgrade found us. Nettles was alive, barely, cracked ribs and a dislocated shoulder, and a temper that improved considerably when William splinted the shoulder, which I won't describe in detail. He couldn't fly, but he could drive, and we had a vehicle, and we used it. The end game was in the forest. I'd have preferred open ground, but you work with what the terrain gives you. The forest was conifer mix, Second growth, with enough canopy to break sight lines at 60 meters and enough deadfall and undergrowth to complicate movement for something that was 8 feet tall and built like a structural column. That was the one advantage the terrain offered us. The upgrade was built for open confrontation, for the kind of hunt where the prey can be seen clearly, and the kill can be executed cleanly, and the trophy can be collected with full acknowledgement of what has been accomplished. Dense forest denied it that. Dense forest meant close work and uncertain angles, and a targeting system that had to work harder for its solutions. We were going to make it work much harder. Williams, Coyle, Baxley, and Nettles formed a perimeter in the tree line, armed and visible, weapons up. The targeting system would see them. That was the point. Brackett stood 50 meters behind them, unarmed with the device. Rory stood next to her, also unarmed, wearing the helmet, broadcasting on the frequency. I was in a tree, 60 feet up, with the rifle and 11 rounds. The upgrade came out of the darkness the way large things move when they're not trying to hide, with absolute confidence, because there is nothing in their experience that should require concealment. It read the perimeter, 4 armed humans in a line, and the targeting system on its shoulder caster slewed toward Williams first because Williams was the largest target and had his weapon up. Rory broadcast a single tone on the helmet. The caster arm twitched, recalibrated, looked for a new targeting solution. Rory broadcast another tone. The caster arm twitched again. What he was doing, which Brackett explained to me later with the patience of someone describing something to a person who will understand it emotionally, even if not technically, was introducing signal noise into the targeting system's sensor feed. Not jamming it, the system was too sophisticated for a straight jam, but creating a feedback loop through the carrier frequency the dogs had responded to, a frequency that was apparently fundamental to how the upgrade's integrated hardware communicated with its biological components, like shouting into someone's ear while they're trying to read. They can't process both inputs simultaneously. The upgrade stopped. For the first time since I'd encountered that species, I watched one of them stop and be uncertain. It stood in the tree line, and its caster arm was cycling through targeting solutions and not locking, and the 4 humans in its perimeter were armed and visible and theoretically its prey, and something in its processing was broken in a way it had no framework for, because no one had ever done this to it before. It had hunted on 100 worlds. It had never encountered a child who could talk to its weapons. I put the first round through the junction between its mechanical carapace integration and the biological tissue of its left shoulder. Not because I thought one round would be enough, because I knew the wound would compromise the integration and cause a cascade failure in the targeting system on that side, which is what Brackett had told me in the barn when we were planning, which is what Rory had confirmed was accurate based on his reading of the device. I worked the bolt. The second round went into the same place, 3 inches lower. The upgrade turned toward my tree. The caster arm was searching, the signal noise still in its feed, but it had localized the threat by sound and muzzle flash and was moving toward the correct azimuth. Coyle came out of the tree line at a dead sprint with a shaped charge that Lynch had carried, and that Coyle had kept because you don't leave a man's gear behind. And he hit the upgrade from the right at full speed and drove the charge into the gap I'd opened in the carapace integration and detonated it from a distance of approximately 0. The blast threw him 20 feet. He landed badly. He got up. I don't know how. I've thought about it since and I don't have a mechanical explanation. He had a cracked sternum and 3 broken ribs from the gymnasium an hour before that, and he got up after being thrown 20 feet by a shaped charge detonation, and Williams was already there, and they held each other up, and Baxley was moving toward the upgrade, which was down. It was down, but it wasn't finished. I came down from the tree. I used the last 9 rounds at close range, working systematically through the anatomy that Brackett had described, the overlap points of the carapace, the junctions between mechanical and biological systems, the places where the engineering and the evolution met and could be separated. Baxley worked alongside me. Neither of us talked. There was nothing to say. It took a long time to finish. When it was done, the upgrade lay in the leaf litter of a forest in North America and bled out in a color that had no name in any human language. And the forest was quiet except for the sound of breathing and the distant beginning of a dawn that none of us had been certain we'd see. Rory took off the helmet. He stood there in the early light and looked at what we'd left in the clearing, and his face had the expression of someone who is carefully organizing what they've seen into a place where it can be examined later. I recognized it. I taught myself the same organization over years after bad deployments. He was doing it naturally at 11. I put my hand on his shoulder and he leaned into it slightly, which was everything. The device, Brackett said. She'd retrieved it from where Rory had set it down. Whatever the first one was bringing, we should figure out what it was for. Later, Williams said. He was looking at Coyle, who was sitting against a tree with the careful stillness of someone managing serious pain but managing it. Later, Brackett agreed. The government came in the morning. They always do after something like this. The cleanup machinery, the classification protocols, the men in suits who look at the evidence and decide how much of reality the general population is ready to understand. Some of that machinery was Traeger's, and Traeger was dead. And there was a period of institutional confusion that created a window of approximately 4 hours during which we were able to sit in the edge of that forest and exist without someone telling us what the official version of the night was going to be. In those 4 hours, Brackett opened the device. It was, as Rory had said, a suit, combat system, but not for the species that had made it or not solely. The interface was calibrated for human morphology, human proportions, human neural response times. Whoever had built it for us. For specifically one of us maybe, but the intent was clear. The first creature hadn't been hunting us. It had been defecting. It had looked at what we were, at the species it had been harvesting from for 1,000 years, taking our genetics and incorporating the useful parts and discarding what remained, and it had concluded something its own civilization apparently hadn't. It had concluded that we weren't just a resource, that there was something in us that was worth preserving whole rather than disassembled and spliced. That the rest of what was coming, whatever the upgrade represented, whatever came behind it, was going to require us to be standing. I've spent a long time in the years since thinking about what that means, about what it says about us that our most persuasive advocate turned out to be something that had been hunting us, that came around to the conclusion not through philosophy or diplomacy, but through the accumulated evidence of 1,000 years of watching us refuse to go quietly. We lose. We lose all the time. We lose personnel and ground and materiel and time, and we get knocked down in ways that should finish the argument, and then we get back up and we reorganize with what we have left, and we come at the problem from the angle we haven't tried yet. We reverse engineer their weapons in barns at 2 in the morning. We talk to their dogs. We build a 40-minute understanding of a targeting system that was designed by minds we can barely conceptualize. Built on physics, we're still developing the language to describe, and we use it to blind the most dangerous thing we've ever encountered long enough to close the distance and take it apart at the seams. We do it hurt. We do it short-handed. We do it with a kid in a helmet and a biologist who memorized 3 hours of alien hardware under stress, and a collection of men who had every reason to conclude the situation was unwinnable, and concluded instead that it was simply unfinished. The upgrade had come for my son because he was useful, because the processing capability that expressed itself as a different way of moving through the world, a different way of mapping language and pattern and signal, that was something they'd identified as valuable, something they wanted to add to their own biology. It never occurred to them that they couldn't have it, that it came attached to something they couldn't model, which was the rest of him. The loyalty and the stubbornness and the absolute refusal to be taken from the people who needed him, and the particular 11-year-old way of being angry that looks like calm until you see what it produces. I was in a government facility for 8 months after that. Not a cell, a lab, technically, which is a distinction that matters less than the people who make it think it does. Rory was with me, and Brackett was 2 corridors over, and we worked on what the device had given us. Williams came by every few weeks. He never stayed long. He had a look about him in those visits that I recognized from the men I'd served with who came back from things that had cost them, not broken, not destroyed, but permanently calibrated to a different set of stakes. He'd sit for an hour and drink bad coffee and look at what we were building and not say much, and then he'd leave. And I knew he was going somewhere and doing something, and that whatever he was doing was quiet and necessary and would not be acknowledged. Coyle called on the satellite phone sometimes, still talking. I expect he'll be talking on his deathbed, and I mean that as high praise. I think about Lynch sometimes, about the specific economy of what he did, the calculation he made in a fraction of a second, the cost he accepted without discussion. There was no dramatic moment, no speech, no final words that I heard. He saw the thing that needed doing and he did it. That's the most human thing I know how to describe. We are not the strongest species. We are probably not the smartest. We are certainly not the most physically capable, and if the last several years have demonstrated anything, it's that we are not alone, that the universe is older and larger and more complicated than the version of it we inherited, and that there are things out there that have been in the business of surviving and dominating and collecting and improving for longer than our civilization has been writing things down. We have something else. I don't have a clean word for it. Spite comes close, but it's too simple. Stubbornness comes close, but it implies a kind of stupidity that misses the point. What I mean is the thing that keeps a man moving when the calculation says he should stop. The thing that turns toward the problem instead of away from it. The thing that looks at a species that has been harvesting you for 1,000 years and thinks, all right, what do you have that we can use? They came for my son. My son is 17 now. He's taller than I expected, and he still has his mother's patience, which I still lack. He's been working with Brackett on the suit, on the system the defector left us, and there are others working alongside them. And what they're building is past my ability to describe in this kind of language, but I understand it in outline, and I think the defector, if it could see it, would understand that it placed the bet correctly. Something is coming. I've known it since the Yucatan, and the files confirm it, and the suit is being built for a reason. I'm not afraid of that. I want to be precise about this, because I've been afraid before and I know what it feels like. I'm not afraid. I'm the particular kind of ready that comes after everything else has been stripped away and what's left is just the decision. We've been on this planet for 200,000 years, and we've survived everything it produced. Ice and drought and each other, which is the hardest one. We've been hunted by things in this universe for apparently as long as the things in this universe have been paying attention to us, and we're still here. And we have gotten harder and sharper and more complicated with every generation. And we have just been given, by an enemy who defected because it couldn't argue with the evidence, the first real tool designed specifically for what's coming. I stood in a forest at dawn with my son's shoulder under my hand, and I looked at what we'd put down. And I thought, we're just getting started.